Hello again, YouTube. Today I want to talk about that notorious phrase, not all men, and the problem with it, and moreover, the problem with statements like it, regardless of whether they deal with gender politics or not. See, here's the time a statement like, not all men actually works. It's when somebody is saying a statement that is all men. They're explicitly saying something like, all men are rapists, all men are scum, like these radical feminists on the fringes of society who apparently believe things like that. In those cases, when they are using what is termed in logic universal qualifiers, all, every, always, never, in that case, pointing out that that universal qualifier of all or never or every or whatever isn't true, you can actually make a valid point by refuting the universal qualifier that they're using. However, in most cases in which this is used as a response, either somebody's making a generalization or they seem to be implicitly making a generalization. Either way, it's in response to a generalization. So let's talk about generalizations for a second. Making generalizations is a part of colloquial speech. People make generalizations in everyday speech. Now that statement itself contains a generalization. Now imagine if somebody were to say to me, oh yeah, well not all people make generalizations. Wouldn't such a response elicit something like an eye roll from you? Wouldn't you want to say, well, thank you, Captain Obvious, your Nobel Prize is in the mail? Because when you boilerplate it down, what somebody who makes a not all such and such statement in response to a generalization is doing is basically saying, you're making a generalization, and that generalization is inherently limited because it does not truly include everyone, and there are exceptions to your generalization. And not only is that painfully obvious, but that person does not seem to understand the concept of a generalization and how it's used in everyday speech. And it's a cousin to what I like to call the your analogy is flawed counter-argument. Because there's a statement that's a truism that says, all analogies are false analogies. And I don't know how many of you have ever had a conversation where you make some sort of analogy, and somebody makes a big deal over the fact that they have pointed out a difference between the two things that you're comparing. Well, what you're saying can't be true because the two things you're comparing in your analogy are not exactly the same. Don't you want to just, take that person aside and be like, look, I don't think you really understand the concept of an analogy, and all you're really doing by pointing out the flaw in my analogy is just proving the truism that all analogies are false analogies? Has anyone ever been in that situation? I'm sure a lot of you probably have encountered something like that. And a lot of you have likewise probably encountered a situation where somebody just doesn't seem to grasp the concept of a generalization. They take the generalization literally and point out the painfully obvious limitations of the generalization. And in most cases, it just elicits eye-rolling. I've just given a handful of examples in which people argue in ways that it's like, I'm sorry to tell you this, but this counter-argument that you think is brilliant really communicates nothing but the painfully obvious, usually ignores the point at hand. Thank you and goodbye. Please return when you have something insightful and meaningful and on point to add to the conversation. One more point I want to make before ending this rant is I am by no means trying to say that you should not confront people's overgeneralizations or generalizations that they make that aren't true, but simply drawing attention to the fact that they're making a generalization by saying, well, not all such and such is not the way to go about it. Actually go after the substance of what they're saying. And for the love of Christ, stop with this not all such and such. Oh yeah, well this exception to the rule and your analogy is flawed. These sorts of things, they're just asinine responses that certain people seem to think are brilliant and devastating counter retorts, and it's aggravating. So that's it. Rant over. Have a nice whatever time it is. Get off my screen.